Okay, so what did it actually take to keep a samurai clan alive? From the outside, it looks almost automatic. A lord has a castle. The castle sits above villages and rice fields. Farmers grow the harvest, the lord collects part of it, and the warriors carrying his crest turn that harvest into power. That is the famous picture. The castle is the asset, the harvest is the income, the retainers are the workforce. War is the moment the investment proves itself. It sounds clean because the people doing the expensive work are outside the frame. You do not see the surveyor arguing over the quality of a field. You do not see the village head trying to divide a weak harvest. You do not see rice waiting in a damp storehouse, a merchant deciding what it is worth, or a low-ranking retainer discovering that an impressive title does not make a late stipend arrive any faster. Here is what the picture leaves out. A field does not pay a retainer. A sack of rice does not maintain a road, finance a procession, purchase supplies, settle a debt, or keep an official working through the winter. Between the crop and the sword stood surveyors, village heads, storehouses, porters, boats, merchants, account books, and a long list of promises that still had to be honored after the harvest was gone. And one clan gives us a nearly perfect way to test that system. Before the year 1600, the Mori House held one of the largest power bases in western Japan, conventionally assessed at roughly 1,200,000 koku. After the Battle of Sekigahara and the settlement that followed, that assessment was cut to roughly 369,000 koku. The family survived. Its retainers did not vanish. Its political responsibilities did not shrink neatly with the map, but most of the formal resource base beneath the organization was gone. So imagine the first set of documents arriving in the new reality. One map shows what the house controlled before the defeat. Another shows what remains. A stipend roll still lists hereditary households. A village register still lists fields and expected output. The ruling center is now Hagi. The question facing the domain is brutally simple. Who gets less? That question will sit underneath everything that follows, because a samurai clan was not just a family of warriors. It was a ruling house at the center of a regional government. Around it were branch families, hereditary retainers, officials, guards, village heads, craftsmen, transport workers, merchants, and thousands of farming households. The crest belonged to one lineage. The institution depended on all of them. The daimyo at the top had enormous authority, but not unlimited modern ownership. He did not personally own every person and every field the way someone owns a private building. He governed under a wider political order. The shogunate could confirm his position, restrict it, transfer him, reduce his territory, or remove him altogether. That is what made the Mori shock possible. A political decision made above the clan could redraw the economic base below it. This is also why control mattered more than a simple claim of ownership. A daimyo was responsible for making the territory governable. Roads and bridges had to remain usable. Disputes had to be settled. Order had to be maintained. When shortages or disasters threatened communities, relief could become a government problem because dead, ruined, or fleeing households could not sustain the domain. Authority created income, but it also created obligations that did not appear in the image of a warrior standing beneath a banner. But before a lord could tax a domain, support retainers, or promise military service, he needed to know what the territory was capable of producing. That began with a rope, a field, and a register. Officials measured plots, recorded their quality, identified cultivators, and estimated output. The result was expressed in koku, a unit associated with rice. You will often hear that one koku represented enough rice to feed one person for a year. That is a traditional rule of thumb, not an exact nutritional law. Its real value was administrative. Rice gave the government a common language. A wet field, a weaker plot, and even non-rice production could be translated into a rice-denominated assessment. That assessment was called kokudaka. It helped rank domains, shape status, set tax expectations, and connect resources to service. Now here is the first trap. Kokudaka was not cash in the treasury. It was not even a guaranteed pile of rice in a warehouse. It was an estimate of what the territory should be able to support. The gap between those two ideas is the gap between looking powerful and being able to pay the next bill. Suppose a field is assessed under good conditions. Then the weather changes, or the soil underperforms, or part of the crop is hidden, or transport losses rise. The number in the register may stay exactly where it was, while the amount that reaches the ruling house falls. That number also carried expectations on the other side. Historical service schedules show the principle clearly. A retainer assessed at 200 koku might owe a relatively small accompanying group. At 10,000 koku, the expected body was much larger. That is a 50-fold difference in assessed income, tied to a radically different level of service. Notice what this means. The number did not merely tell people how rich the retainer looked, it told the ruling house what kind of service it believed that income should sustain. A higher position carried more prestige, but it could also carry more people to support, more equipment to maintain, and a larger obligation when the Lord called. The details varied, and these schedules were not always enforced in full, so there is no honest formula that turns Chōshū into an exact army. But the mechanism is unmistakable. Income came with duty attached. A grant or stipend did not simply reward a family name, it supported a household expected to serve. In wartime, that could mean military attendance. In peace, it could mean guarding, policing, surveying, teaching, tax administration, or office work. The dramatic moment was the army assembling. The expensive part was keeping the hierarchy ready long before the order arrived. Picture the call for service moving down the chain. The Lord does not search the countryside for volunteers. Orders go to retainer households whose rank, support, and expected contribution have already been recorded. Officers gather people and equipment. Storehouses open. Horses, food, weapons, and transport have to appear in the right place at the right time. The army can assemble quickly only because the economic promises behind it have been maintained slowly. But writing a tax demand into a register does not make the grain appear at the castle. Between the field and the treasury stood the village. The daimyo's officials did not personally collect every sack from every household. Local administration depended heavily on village heads and community structures. They kept records, organized collection, communicated demands, and represented the village upward. The castle issued authority. The village made that authority workable, and that gave the village more importance than the famous hierarchy suggests. The domain needed production, tax compliance, labor, information, and enough stability that people stayed on the land. The village needed order, irrigation, roads, dispute resolution, and relief when disaster struck. Neither side had equal power, but neither side could simply ignore the other. How hard could the Lord press? Late period evidence from 1868 shows just how different the answer could be. Some villages surrendered around 70% of rice yield. Others surrendered around 15%. Same broad political order, but a difference of more than 4 times between the lighter and heavier end. That is not a small accounting variation. At the heavier end, the village gives up nearly 5 parts for every 1 part surrendered at the lighter end. The difference changes what remains for food, seed, tools, recovery, and the next harvest. It also changes how much room the community has when weather turns against it. A tax rate can look productive in the castle accounts while quietly reducing the village's ability to survive the next shock. That is why a large collection in 1 year is not automatically proof of a healthy system. The relevant question is what the same fields and households will still be able to produce after the collection is over. There was no universal tax percentage for every domain and every century. Local productivity, custom, bargaining, political pressure, and resistance all mattered. And resistance was not theoretical. Communities petitioned, they concealed production. Some fled together or rebelled. Those actions could force concessions because a village pushed past recovery stops being a useful tax base. Now picture a village head after a bad harvest. The official assessment still sits in the register. The tax demand still exists. Somewhere else, a retainer household expects support. The domain still has roads to maintain and political duties to meet. But the rice in front of the village head is real, limited, and already divided between tax, seed, food, and survival. Someone has to decide which promise gets broken. The village may hide part of the crop. The domain may reduce the demand. A household may borrow. A retainer may wait. A merchant may advance credit. The shortage does not disappear. It moves. Once rice was collected, the pressure changed shape. Now the domain had a physical commodity. It had to be measured, bagged, guarded, kept dry, transported, allocated, or sold. A granary full of rice looked like wealth, but the ruling house still had expenses that rice could not automatically settle where and when they arrived. This is where merchants became indispensable. Formally, merchants ranked below warriors. Practically, warrior governments needed their warehouses, brokers, exchange networks, and credit. Domain rice could move into commercial centers, enter warehouses, be sold through brokers, and become money or credit instruments that could meet cash expenses. The warrior had status. The merchant made the conversion possible. That does not mean merchants secretly ruled the domain. They had their own constraints. But it does mean a ruling house could be rich in assessed production and still be short of spendable money. It could have future tax claims and bills due now. It could own rice in one place while needing coin in another. It could promise support in rice terms while retainers bought goods in a cash market. So follow one bale. It leaves a producing village after the community has kept what it is permitted or able to retain. It enters storage, where moisture, theft, and handling matter. It travels by road or water. A merchant helps sell or finance it. Old debts may already claim part of the proceeds. What remains finally becomes usable for the next obligation. Now change one variable. The market price falls before the domain sells. The bale is still there. The official kokodaka has not changed. The castle looks the same, but the coin produced by that shipment is lower, while the stipend roll and political calendar remain exactly where they were. That is how a clan could look stable in every ceremonial way and still feel a financial shock. And waiting at the end of the chain was not a temporary fighting force, hired only when war appeared. It was a hereditary service class. A retainer household could hold rank, receive support, occupy a residence near the castle, perform government work, and pass its position through generations. During the long Tokugawa peace, many samurai served as officials, police, guards, teachers, surveyors, and tax collectors. The armor might stay in storage while its owner spent the day reviewing village records. Peace changed the job. It did not cancel the household. Imagine a lower-ranking retainer in the castle town. His family depends on a stipend tied to the domain's resource system. He performs duties the government still needs. His position carries status, but status does not guarantee that support keeps pace with prices or arrives untouched by the domain's debt. Now put him beside the village head from the earlier scene. The village head needs enough harvest left in the community to preserve production. The retainer needs the support his household was promised. The ruling house depends on both. Pay the retainer by squeezing the village too hard, and the future tax base weakens. Protect the village by cutting the retainer too deeply, and the government damages the service network that collects taxes and enforces authority. Borrow to satisfy both, and the next harvest arrives with old claims already attached to it. That is the trap a castle painting never shows. The cost is also the operating system. A daimyo could dismiss retainers and save resources. He could also lose the officials who guarded gates, surveyed fields, policed roads, carried messages, and made his authority real outside the castle walls. The castle town concentrated that dependence. Retainer residences clustered near the political center. Craftsmen and merchants supplied them. Roads and waterways brought food and materials. The castle gathered power into one place, but it also gathered thousands of people who needed the domain's distribution system to keep working. And that changed the consequences of a weak year. A shortage was no longer confined to the village where the crop failed. It could travel with the tax shipment, arrive in the treasury as lower income, pass into the stipend system as reduced support, and finally appear in the market as weaker demand from the households surrounding the castle. One bad harvest could move through several groups that never stood in the same field. Then the wider political order added another bill. Under the Tokugawa system, many daimyo had to maintain residences and entourages in both their domains and Edo and travel periodically between them. The processions were spectacular. Ranked retainers, pack animals, equipment, servants, and officials moving along the roads in a public display of status. To the crowd, it looked like power. To the domain, it was food, lodging, horses, transport, clothing, staff, maintenance, and a second residence that had to be supported while the home government kept running. It would be too simple to say alternate attendance existed only to bankrupt the daimyo. It served broader political purposes including attendance, supervision, and the organization of relations between the shogunate and the domains, but the financial pressure was real. A weak harvest did not cancel the journey. A falling rice price did not close the Edo residence. And now the deepest economic problem finally comes into view. The clan had made service durable. It had also made the cost of service durable. Harvests changed. Tax collections varied. Rice prices moved. Transport failed. Credit tightened. A political settlement could remove most of the assessed base at once. The retainers, offices, residences, debts, and political obligations did not adjust at the same speed. That is why the Mori reduction was so dangerous. Their formal resource base fell from roughly 1,200,000 to roughly 369,000 koku, but the institution did not become one-third of its former complexity overnight. Now return to Hagi. Put four things on the table. The first is the new map. It shows a much smaller domain. The second is the old service structure. It represents households, ranks, and obligations inherited from the larger one. The third is a new survey register. If the Mori are going to survive, they need a more accurate picture of what the remaining territory can actually produce. The fourth is a sheet of paper. That last object looks ordinary. Economically, it represents an attempt to create another route into the treasury. Chōshū's response involved tighter administration, new surveys, changes to retainer support, and greater involvement in profitable commodities. Paper is the clearest documented example. The domain did not abandon rice. It tried to capture more value from a product that could move through commercial markets. And this is where the reform becomes visible. The map says the old scale is gone. The stipend roll says the old promises are still expensive. The survey asks whether the remaining base has been fully counted. The paper workshop asks whether labor and commerce can bring in resources the old assessment alone cannot provide. None of those documents solves the problem by itself. Together, they show what survival actually required. The ruling house had to revise the relationship between land, production, retainers, merchants, and the treasury. A paper monopoly was not free money. Raw material had to be gathered. Workers had to produce sheets of reliable quality. Officials had to supervise the channel. Merchants had to move and sell the finished product. Buyers still had to want it. But unlike the old official number, paper created a new transaction the domain could influence. That distinction matters. Kokodaka told the ruling house what the territory was supposed to support. Commercial production created a chance to bring in additional usable revenue. The Mori therefore faced several decisions at once. How much support could be preserved? Which offices could be consolidated? How tightly could the remaining land be surveyed? How much revenue could be captured from commodities without crushing the producers? How much dependence on merchants and markets was acceptable? And each decision changed the next one. Reduce support, and the domain may save resources while weakening the households that staff it. Tighten the survey, and the treasury may discover more taxable capacity while creating new conflict with the communities being measured. Expand commodity controls, and the government may gain revenue while becoming more exposed to merchant networks and market demand. Borrow, and today's survival becomes a claim on tomorrow's production. There was no painless answer. Retainers could lose support. Villages could face tighter demands. Producers could carry the burden of policies designed to strengthen the ruling house. Borrowing could move the cost into the future. Every solution protected one part of the system by placing more pressure somewhere else. That is not a moral footnote. It is the actual distribution of the loss. And this is where the Mori case delivers its answer. The house survived. It continued ruling Chōshū until the domain system ended in 1871. That does not mean one monopoly or one survey explains everything that happened later. Chōshū's later importance involved political, military, educational, institutional, and institutional forces beyond this economic story. But survival itself proves something specific. The clan did not survive because the old economic arrangement remained intact. It survived because the arrangement changed. The resource base was measured again. Support was reorganized. Administration tightened. Commercial routes mattered more. The ruling house preserved enough of the service network to keep governing on a smaller formal base. Now compare that with the image we started with. The public symbol of the clan was the castle. But the castle could not tell you whether the domain's assessment was accurate, whether villages could withstand another demand, whether rice could be converted at a workable price, whether debts had already claimed the next harvest, or whether the retainer waiting for support still believed the ruling house could keep its promise. The public symbol of the samurai was the sword. But the sword could not measure a field, store grain, negotiate collection, finance transport, or turn paper into revenue. A clan remained powerful only while those less dramatic tasks kept happening. That is why two domains with similar official assessments could produce very different outcomes. One might have productive land, credible surveys, workable tax arrangements, reliable transport, commercial access, manageable debts, and a retainer body it could still support. Another might have the same number on paper and far less usable capacity underneath it, the number measured in expectation. The system determined whether the expectation became power. So what did it actually take to keep a samurai clan alive? The domain had to complete the conversion again and again. Productive land had to become a credible assessment. The assessment had to become a collectible share. The collected goods had to reach storage and markets. Their value had to cover administration, political duties, and a hereditary service network without exhausting the communities producing them. And all of that operated beneath a daimyo, whose right to govern could still be altered by the authority above him. A failed harvest on its own might be survivable, so might a weak market or an expensive political obligation. The real danger came when several pressures met: less production, lower sale value, old debts, resistant villages, and retainers whose support could not be cut without weakening the government itself. At that point, the castle could remain standing long after the economic power beneath it had started to fail. From the outside, the samurai is still the first thing you see. He wears the armor, carries the weapon, sits on the horse, and stands beneath the family crest. But his position begins much farther away. It begins with a field being measured. A village deciding what it can surrender, a bale staying dry long enough to reach a market, a merchant turning that bale into money, a household trusting that its service will still be supported, and a ruling house trying to keep every one of those promises connected after the map beneath it has changed. The warrior was the visible proof that the system worked. The clan was the system.